Welcome to the Fatherhood Challenge, a movement to awaken and inspire fathers everywhere to take great pride in their role and to challenge society to understand how important fathers are to the stability and culture of their family's environment. Now, here's your host, Jonathan Guerrero.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. We are continuing part 2 of my conversation with Rebekah Wen as she shares her testimony of how she found her identity and purpose. If you missed part 1 of her story, you can go to thefatherhoodchallenge.com. That's thefatherhoodchallenge.com. And if you go to the last episode, you'll see it labeled as part 1. You can hear the first part of our testimony. Now we're going to go ahead and continue with part 2 of her testimony.
So as I was sitting there, I just thought to myself, God doesn't want broken people like me. And I heard an audible voice say, I came for the broken. And I felt these huge, warm arms wrap around me. And I fell to the ground in this concrete basement and I cried. And I felt a father holding me for the first time. And I knew that God was there with me and that he had come for me and that every single speck of my brokenness could be healed by him. And in that moment, I decided that I had to become a Christian. I needed this comfort. I'd never felt anything like that before. I was so excited. I wanted to tell everybody all about it. I ran upstairs and I told my mom, like, Mom, guess what? I'm going to be a Christian now, and she was kind of like, yeah, great, but she didn't have the reaction I expected. And I wish that I could say everything after that just immediately got better, but it did not. Some things did. So I'd had, for those 13 years, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I had been sexually and physically abused by a female relative. Almost immediately after I became a Christian, the sexual abuse, the verbal abuse completely stopped. It was, for me, a hugely eye-opening moment because I thought I understood for the first time that there's something really wrong with me. And I need some kind of, deliverance from this. I understood for the first time that these entities that were attacking me were demonic and that they had a purpose when they were coming. But I had no idea how to deal with it. I didn't know what any of it meant. And I still hadn't told anybody about any of them. My mother remarried when I was 7. And the man that she married was a very stable, good man who had a good job and took good care of us and enabled her to be a stay-at-home mom so that she could homeschool us. And by all accounts, he was a good, solid man. But he was not emotionally available. He was not interested in really being a dad to other people's kids. And so he would work most of the time, and then, maybe we'd have some kind of a philosophical conversation or something, but he wasn't really interested in discussing God. He was much more interested in discussing science and mathematics and philosophy. And yet there was a moment that had a major impact on me. There was one day where my mother was just tired of it, and she was just tired. And at the same time also, as I mentioned, I had been having anorexia, and it had progressed to the point where I would stop eating, and I was noticeably underweight for my age. My mother would, every single meal, she would have to trick me into eating. And she would do that because she knew that I had such a strong feeling of guilt about the idea of making anything else feel as worthless as I felt. Because I felt I was trash. I didn't want anything else to feel that way. I didn't want to be the cause of anyone else or anything else to feel that kind of suffering. And by this point, I was hoarding. I mean, I wouldn't even throw away trash. I would have hundreds of candy wrappers and stuff around my room and stacked up and everything, which I know sounds strange for anorexic, but whatever. But I wouldn't throw away anything because I didn't want it to feel like trash. Even if it was trash, I couldn't stand the idea of acknowledging that something didn't have any more value. I had to prove it had value, because if it didn't have value, then maybe I don't have value. So I would cling to everything. And so my mother figured that out. And she had realized that my hoarding was because of this deep feelings in me. And so she would get me to eat by guilt tripping me. So she would use this cute, tiny little voice, and she would literally take one bite of like vegetables or something, and she'd be like, "Oh, please eat me. If you don't eat me, I'll be so sad." She would make it like this thing that if I didn't eat this food, I was making it miserable. I was causing it the same harm that had been caused to me on some level. And that was the only way she could get me to really eat. And so she was doing this every single day, and she was tired. And one day she talked to my stepdad, and he came over to me, and he sat down on the floor next to me. And I was not even making eye contact. I'm just sitting there doing my homework, pretending, to be the kind of daughter they wanted. And he was trying to talk to me about what was going on. And I just told him, like, "Look, I don't know why you're talking to me. You don't love me." I just remember glancing over at him because he didn't say anything. And I glanced over at him and I saw that he was crying. And I felt such immense guilt. When you make your dad cry, like, that's such immense guilt. And all he said was, "I'm so sorry you feel that way." And if that for me was a major turning point, because I really realized that I want to be able to feel that human love and connection, and to recognize it and to live in it like they do, like my family does. And I couldn't. So it was a major turning point for me. So a few months after that, I'm a baby Christian. I'm super excited. I'm still living my goth life, all black from head to toe. But even though I had gone through this, and I was still continuing to try to cling to my faith and to grow as a little baby Christian, the spiritual attacks that I was undergoing just became more and more intense. And they became constant anxiety, to the point that I would create rituals that had to be completed throughout the day, or I had a real fear that my family was going to die. These rituals started off as something really simple, like, before my parents would leave the house, they absolutely had to give me a hug and say goodbye, because I was afraid that the last thing we would say before they died would be something terrible. So we had to leave on good footing, right? It had to be a hug, and we had to say specific phrases. And right before I went to bed, we had to have a hug, and we had to say specific phrases. And it grew over time to the point where before I would go to bed, there would be like a 5-minute speech, a 5-minute dialogue that my parents and I would have to say every single night perfectly. If I messed up, we had to start over, because I was so absolutely sure that something catastrophic would happen if we didn't do these rituals. And so they became more and more, they became larger and more repetitive and more all-consuming as time went on. My sleeping habits and everything, they just became more difficult, because even though I was taking these precautions, or with arrangings of the bed and the room and the lights and everything, it wasn't helping at all. And these entities were becoming more and more aggressive. And I was to a point where I could see them all the time. So I could see, I could just be walking around outside and see them, hanging on somebody's shoulder or something. This idea of like, if I look at a mirror, the image will morph. It began to become, if I just look at your face, it's going to morph. So I couldn't even look at my own family without constantly seeing these things that would say and do whatever they wanted. Because I'm also still having these out-of-body experiences, they started to become part of just everyday thought for me, where I could just be having a pleasant conversation like, "Oh yeah, I'd really love to have mac and cheese for dinner." And what I would be seeing as I'm saying that would be myself holding a knife and cutting their throat and them bleeding everywhere. Like horrible, horrible things that I had no actual desire to do. But I would be seeing these visions all the time. And they became more and more graphic and more violent and more consistent. And at the same time, these entities would come into my bed. So they would climb under the blankets with me, and they would start to hurt me. I would have cuts and bruises. And I got to a point where I even started to disassociate from my own body. And I believe that's because I was having so many of these out-of-body experiences. I started to disassociate from my own body, and it began with my right arm. It would start to, if I looked at it or thought about it, even just pondering something else, but I would just kind of stare at my arm would begin to sort of become numb and heavy. And I would have this knowledge that I was not in control of it, and it could move by itself. And so I would see my arm move, even though I wasn't telling it to. And I really started to become afraid of it. And it got to the point where I really felt like it was going to spread and take over my whole body. But before it could even do that, it started to cause me real physical harm, like trying to strangle me and it would leave marks on my neck because for these actions, or scratch marks across my whole chest and everything. And I wouldn't do this to myself. I'd never been a person to necessarily like self-harm. But I was so sure that they were gaining control of my body as time went on, that I started to look into how I could have my arm surgically removed before it would spread to the rest of me. So that leads me into being 16 years old. And my mother at this point has noticed that these things are, something is seriously wrong. And she has come across a book called The Bondage Breaker. At that time, every morning before we start our homeschool routine, she's reading passages of scripture and praying with us. And she decides, like, enough Elizabeth Elliot, let's try this. And so she, I love Elizabeth Elliot, by the way, but she sits down and she's like, okay, girls, I don't know if this is going to work. Like, I don't know what you guys will think of this. It's we've never really talked about demons and stuff, but let's just read it. Let's just read it and see what happens. The first day she read it, I remember having some kind of a feeling that was just like, no, don't listen to what she's saying. Don't listen. But I did pay attention. And this book is amazing because it actually gives you specific prayers that you can say word for word. And this book, it is about spiritual warfare. It is about fighting the enemy. And the idea that you could, for me at that time, the idea that I could have power and could stop what was happening to me was beautiful. It was incredible. And I just latched onto it. So I memorized one of the prayers from that book. That was the first time I actually sat down. I told my mom, like, Mom, I'm seeing things at night. What does the book say about that? And so I memorized a prayer, and I thought, okay, next time these things happen, next time they come, I'm gonna say it, right? So that night I go to bed and I wake up, and on that day it was some kind of there were 3 of them. It was like a sort of a black shadowy man, and then some kind of an alligator thing that was floating next to my bed. And there was, I want to say, almost a woman trying to play with my hair. And I didn't want to look over at her because she had a really disturbing face. But so they came, and I remember thinking to myself, okay, you got to fight. You have to fight. This is your chance. Do it. And it was one of the physically most difficult things I've ever done in my life, just to open my mouth and speak. It was like my mouth was wired shut. I was just clenching my teeth, just trying as hard as I could to get my mouth open and say the prayer as best as I could remember. And I did. And you know what? They went away. They literally vanished. And I was like, what? This works? This can work? There was a solution this whole time? I was so excited. The next morning, I was like, Mom, you're not going to believe this. You're not going to believe what happened. I need to tell all my friends. I just dove into the book. I even brought friends over, and I was like, you need an exorcism too. And so just diving right into it. And because for me, it was incredible what happened. I started praying this every time I had a vision, every time they came to me, every time I even felt their presence before I could even see them. I would start praying. And I had to pray it out loud. It didn't work if I prayed it in my head. I had to pray it out loud. So I would start praying, and they would leave. Every single time they would leave. And the result was that I regained control of my hands. I stopped having nightmares. I was able to sleep on my back for the first time in almost a decade. Like, I'd always slept on one side and it couldn't move. Now I could sleep in other positions. I could look in people's faces again. I could even look in a mirror, That took a really long time though. But I could do these normal things. Like, they were just gone. And the out-of-body experiences disappeared as well. I haven't had any of those since that time. So here I am. I've been amazingly healed. I know 100% is through the power of God. I know that it's through Jesus Christ and through the identity that they have given me as a daughter of the King. Because the way these prayers work is that you claim your identity. I am a daughter of the Lord God Almighty, and you cannot touch me. You claim your identity and you say, on the authority of my Father, you cannot be here. It has nothing to do with my grace, my goodness, nothing. It is all His power. And because it's all His power, they have to leave right away. And so that gave me this idea that I needed to consider my identity. Was I really living like God's daughter? Not my mother's daughter, not my father's daughter. Was I living like God's daughter? But with my father, he actively encouraged me to dress to dress as a slut, to wear tiny, tiny outfits whenever we went out. By the time I was in my teens, he would use my debit card and his ID to go buy alcohol for us. And every minute of time that I spent with him was centered around playing. It was centered around D&D or witchcraft or these kinds of other things. Nothing was centered around right here, right now. Who are we? Our relationship, this world, what's actually happening. Everything was just play and feel good. And so I had this complete disconnect between these two people because my father did not want a good little Christian girl. He was very happy to have a teenager who was open about her pornography addiction and loved drinking alcohol and all this stuff. Whereas my mother, she needed a good little Christian girl. So I had to reconcile these two different people. That took a long time, but I was able to do it because my foundation was no longer making my mom and dad happy. It was, what does my God want? The person who's saving me. And I think that's a core of my life. If I could take this and make it a message for any parents, protect your kids. If you see something that's strange, if they're having a lot of nightmares, if you see them acting in a strange way, don't avoid conflict. Don't try to sweep it under the rug. Like, after I was healed and I started opening up to family members about what I had been through, the number one reaction I got was, oh, well, we knew there was something wrong with you, but we didn't think we could say anything. It blows my mind because I was a child. What was I going to do if you said something? I don't know, maybe rethink my life? Where was the backlash? Where was the potential for them to have problems? But because nobody spoke anything, I had no protection from any of the things that I went through. I had zero protection in that way. So if I could say anything to parents, is that protect your kids, not just from these physical things, but be involved in the things like what they're scared of, the nightmares and these things. Protect them from those. I had a significant healing, but I wasn't really truly born again until a few years later. I never went to a church because I had such bad experiences with other believers when I was young. And even though I was healed and everything, I was still 100% a goth, and I was very happy to maintain that image. It wasn't until I was an adult and about 21 years old, terrible situation happened and the family sort of exploded. And in that time, I ended up homeless and I ended up by myself. And I only had God to cling to every single day. All day long, I would just tell myself, God is love, God is mercy, God is love, God is mercy, God is love, God is mercy. And that was how I got through that time. But because I clung to the Lord so much, I realized I literally just wanted to be sequestered. I wanted to become a nun. And my grandmother said, why don't you try a missionary instead? And so I was learning Russian at the time. And so my grandmother said, well, why don't you try and go to school? There's this missionary school in Russia. Why don't you go there and check it out? And so without thinking about it, I was like, yeah, I'd love to be in Russia and everything and be closer to God. Sure, let's do it. So I signed up and everything. And then when I'm on the plane, I had a realization that I was literally going to live with other Christians. And I don't think hate would be too strong of a word. I hated being around Christians because of my past experiences. And I also hated kids up to this point. And the reason I hated kids was because I was still so dirty from all the things that had happened previously. I still believed and lived in the enemy's lies that I was a creature of shame and that I was filthy. And I did not want to get my problems. I didn't want it to spread to any kids. And so I just decided that they were terrible. And I convinced myself to stay as far away from children as possible because I did not want my filth to spread to them. So here I am on the plane on the way to Russia. And I suddenly have this realization, I'm going to go and live with Christians. And I panicked. I was like, I'm going to stay on this plane because Moscow's just a stopover. Then it's going to Malaysia. I'm just going to get off on Malaysia and deal with everything then. Call everybody and be like, hey, I'm here now. I was like, run away. And, but then as we landed in Moscow, they said, everybody has to get off and we're going to bring on the search dogs. Well, I was like, okay, all right, I will get off. I don't want to deal with any dogs. So I get off and they pick me up. We go to the house. And we open the door, and what's the first thing I see? It's a baby. So now I'm surrounded by Christians and babies. And then they lead me up to my bedroom, and what do I see? My roommate. She's just a, hi! She's just this preppy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed little valley girl. And I'm like, oh, Lord, why do you torment me? Like, why would you do this to me? This is going to be the worst mistake I've ever made in my life. Like, what is happening? And so I tell everybody, like, guys, I'm so tired. I just need to go to bed. So everybody leaves except for my one German roommate. And she's sitting there and I'm laying down on my bed and she says, I am so glad you are here because before you were not. And now we are complete. And my heart completely broke. And the Lord spoke to me audibly. I brought you here to heal you. Let me do it. And I said, okay, my heart is yours. This is the first time I've been wanted. Do your will. And what he did, I became truly born again in Russia a couple months later. We were going through a program where every week we would have teachers teach us about a different topic. And that particular week, we were learning about God as a father. I'd always known about Jesus and the great warrior and loving, typical church things, but I'd never thought about God as an actual father who actually loved me. And so during that week, the culmination of that week was for us to have a public confession where we would confess everything that had been done to us. We would name names, list deeds, and we would confess everything that we had done. And throughout the whole week, the Lord was telling me, this is your chance. You've got a lot to say. At the end of the week, that morning, because this was a mixed group, there were adults and children, I went to the leader of the group and I said, I feel like I have something to say, but I feel like it's a really heavy topic. And I don't know if it's appropriate to talk about in front of the kids. And up to this point, I had not thought about what I would actually say. I didn't know. I just knew I had to say something, but I didn't know what it was. And I had never thought about what came out of my mouth because she asked me, what do you want to talk about? And I'd never thought these words or made this sentence ever in my life. But I looked her dead in the eyes and I said, I was physically, emotionally, and sexually abused for the first 13 years of my life. And that to me was like, I was? Where did that come from? I'd never thought about it, ever. And she said, bring it on. Let's do it. That day, I think I was the third person to talk. I publicly confessed what was done to me and what had been done. It took hours because I realized as I was going through names, I couldn't even remember all the names of the people who had sexually assaulted me. I could see faces and things, but I couldn't even remember the names. And it took hours of just sobbing and telling it. And here I'm sitting in front of a room of 20, 30 people, and they're all just listening in silence and asking me these patient questions and praying the whole time. And by the time I finished, I can say that I had been completely washed clean white as snow. Everything that had any power of shame over my life was in public, and it was forgiven, and I was completely free. And that afternoon, as they were making dinner and I'm sitting there doing some homework in the living room, some of the children of the household are playing there. And for the first time in my life, without even thinking about it, even as a child, I didn't play. I didn't play with other kids. I only spent time with adults as much as I could. But for the first time in my life, I put down my pencil and my homework and I played with them. And I can't express how beautiful that freedom was to truly be free with nothing, no shame, nothing held over me. If you ever have a chance to do a public confession, I fully encourage it, because that was what broke the final curses over my life and gave me a stability in who I am. And that the Lord would patiently and carefully take me to a place where He would dig out every piece of junk that had been put onto me so that I could be free, so I could fly above everything. I think the last step in my completely being free was I realized that when we went to that Mayan temple when I was a very young child, whatever clung to me came in through an open door. In the deliverance ministry, I figured out exactly what entity it was, and I could tell it to leave by name. And that was the moment when I really lost a lot of fear for it. You know, it's like, you're not so spooky if you got a name, and I can just be like, hey, dude, go. Like, not that they're not powerful, but that they're limited. They're limited. And that was something that happened really recently, because for many years, these entities hadn't bothered me, but they'd started to come back with my daughter. And she started to have nightmares and to say things that little tiny toddlers should not say. And so I realized that I had to learn how to fight for her. I had to learn how to fight as her legal guardian on a spiritual level. So that's why I went back into this and said, okay, what is it? What entity is clinging to me that could potentially be affecting her or could still be clinging to me? And when we identified it and went through and prayed it away, as the saying goes, I'm happy to say that my daughter did stop having nightmares. That is my story in a nutshell. So I would say to fathers, base your identity in the eternal things. Build yourself onto that. And for your children, encourage them, bring them along to do the same, especially for young kids or teenagers, especially with this era of social media. There are so many influences, so many things that seem so important and so amazing and so life-changing and so necessary. So for your children's sake, redirect their interest. Remove those influences and redirect their interest and their concept of strength on the same thing, the Rock of Ages. If they can stand on that, they will stand with you.
Rebekah, thank you so much for coming on the Fatherhood Challenge and sharing your testimony with us.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatherhood Challenge. If you would like to contact us, listen to other episodes, find any resource mentioned in this program, or find out more information about the Fatherhood Challenge, please visit thefatherhoodchallenge.com. That's thefatherhoodchallenge.com.